There is a version of the Bible that most Christians have never laid eyes on, not because it's fraudulent, not because it's irrelevant, but because for centuries, Western religious institutions deliberately decided you didn't need to know it existed. This Bible contains 82 books, not the Protestant standard of 66, not the Catholic 73, a staggering 82 complete books meticulously preserved in an ancient language called Ge'ez, nestled high in the Ethiopian mountains. What makes this text truly groundbreaking isn't just the sheer volume of extra scriptures, it's the explosive knowledge those books unveil, teachings on tangible spiritual authority, specific prayers Jesus himself utilized, yet which were intentionally scrubbed from the canonical Gospels, wisdom that, according to traditions maintained for 1,700 years, was systematically suppressed. The oldest known copies of this Ethiopian Bible are dubbed the Garima Manuscripts. These treasures date back between 390 and 660 AD. That timeline makes them considerably older than the celebrated Codex Vaticanus, the foundational text Rome relies upon. Carbon dating has verified this. Oxford University has authenticated it. This is not fringe theory, this is documented peer-reviewed history. But here is the crucial fact you rarely hear. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never accepted the rulings of the Roman councils. When the Council of Rome in 382 AD dictated which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopia was absent. When the Council of Carthage in 397 finalized the Western canon, Ethiopian voices were utterly disregarded. Why? Because by that time, Ethiopia had already become geographically sealed off from the Mediterranean world. Trade routes had shifted. The Islamic invasions of the 7th century would sever communication completely, and in that crucial isolation, something miraculous occurred. Ethiopia acted as a time capsule, preserving documents Rome chose to excise, texts like the complete Book of Enoch. This is the very text cited by the Apostle Jude himself in the New Testament, verse 14. Yet it was yanked from the Western canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364. The official explanation? Doubts about authorship. The genuine reason, as we are about to uncover, is far more unsettling. Texts like the Book of Jubilees, which reveals a sacred calendar and time cycles that religious authorities decreed you weren't meant to grasp. Texts containing instructions for powerful invocation. 7 specific orations which, according to Ethiopian traditions, held sacred by monks in remote cliffside monasteries, Jesus entrusted to his closest disciples. Prayers designed to facilitate not just physical healing, not just spiritual deliverance, but, and these ancestral claims are truly staggering, even the resurrection of the dead. Now, before you dismiss this as unsubstantiated mysticism, consider the hard evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls unearthed at Qumran in 1947 contained multiple fragments of the Book of Enoch. This provides irrefutable proof that the text predates Christ and was revered as sacred by Jewish communities of the era. Dr. James Van der Kam of Notre Dame University has thoroughly documented the authenticity of these scriptures, so the question is not whether these texts are ancient. The real question is, why were they expunged? And this is where the historical narrative takes a disturbing turn. Because when you analyze the pattern, which scriptures survived and which were systematically censored, one clear motive emerges. Texts that empowered individuals to access direct spiritual experience, bypassing institutional mediation, were ruthlessly purged. The specific invocations designed to let any believer tap into the spiritual power Jesus promised, these signs will follow those who believe, Mark 16:17. Those orations were buried. Coincidence? You are about to realize it is anything but. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus frequently prays. Yet, the exact specific words he spoke are almost never recorded. The Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6 is the exception, not the rule. When Jesus resurrected Lazarus in John 11, the text says he looked up to heaven and prayed, but it never reveals the words he used. When Peter resurrected Tabitha in Acts 9, the text mentions he knelt down and prayed, but once again the specific phrases are left out. Why this systematic deletion? Were the biblical authors merely negligent, or was there a far deeper rationale? According to manuscripts preserved in Ethiopia and traditions orally transmitted by monks for centuries, the precise wording of these power prayers was intentionally edited out of the texts compiled by Rome, not because they were unknown, but because equipping individual believers with this potent knowledge posed a seismic threat to the developing model of priestly mediation. Let me be absolutely clear. I am not discussing magic spells or empty incantations. I am referring to profound contemplative practices, prayer techniques utilized by the Desert Fathers, Anthony of Egypt, Pachomius, in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Practices that routinely produced what they called signs and wonders, exactly as documented in Acts 2:43. The Ethiopian tradition pinpoints 7 distinct orations taught by Jesus, each one serving a different spiritual purpose. Transmitted from master to disciple, kept alive in monastic communities that had zero contact with Rome. The first, the prayer of spiritual opening, designed for what the Book of Enoch describes as opening the eyes of the heart, a contemplative discipline that allowed for direct spiritual perception. The second and third, the healing orations, not vague petitions asking God to heal if it is your will, but active declarations of faith coupled with the laying on of hands exactly as Jesus mandated in Mark 16:18. The fourth, the prayer of angelic communication, grounded in the Book of Enoch's teachings on how the righteous could interact with spiritual dimensions. This is the precise reason Enoch was removed. It contained too much detail about unmediated mystical experience. The fifth and sixth, the deliverance orations. In the earliest Christian movement, any believer could cast out unclean spirits. It was a promised gift in Mark 16:17. But by the 6th century, the Council of Tours had institutionalized exorcism. Only authorized priests were permitted to perform it. Coincidence? And the seventh, the prayer that titles this investigation, the invocation that, according to these ancient traditions, could call the breath of life back into the deceased. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds astonishing. Perhaps too astonishing. But remember that Elisha himself resurrected a dead child in 2 Kings 4:32-35. The text describes him having prayed to the Lord and the child revived. What words did he use? The text doesn't disclose them. Peter resurrected Tabitha. Paul raised Eutychus in Acts 20:10. In every instance there was prayer. In every instance the specific potent words were omitted from the canonical record. The Ethiopian traditions assert that those words were not forgotten. They were preserved, and they were deliberately excluded from the texts that made their way west. If you have ever felt that something critical was missing from the story you were told, if you have sensed there is a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered, you are not alone and you are not wrong. I have spent years plumbing the depths of what was hidden, removed, and erased from the biblical narrative. I have compiled this research into a powerful resource. Why the Apostles Concealed Jesus' Most Dangerous Words. This digital manuscript is for the seekers, for the relentless questioners, for people like you who refuse to settle for because that's how we've always done it. It's available now in the first pinned comment. Download your copy before this window slams shut. Read it, challenge it, let it challenge you. And if it resonates deep within your soul, come back here and simply type truth. That single word will connect you with thousands of others on the same journey. Do not let fear or doubt stop you from uncovering what has been hidden in plain sight. The first of the 7 prayers is not a mere request, it is an authoritative declaration, and that distinction fundamentally reshapes everything. In most Western Christian traditions, you are taught to pray by asking, God, please make this happen. Lord, if it is your will, allow that. Prayers of supplication, prayers of dependence. But in Mark 11:23-24, Jesus teaches something revolutionary. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in their heart but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. He is not praying, asking God to move the mountain. He is commanding the mountain to move. And he promises that if you speak in faith, without a shadow of a doubt, it shall be done for you. This is the foundation of the first prayer. Ethiopian traditions call it the prayer of the awakened heart. It is not vague mysticism. It is a documented contemplative discipline that also appears in Eastern Christian texts like the Philokalia, a collection of writings on hesychast prayer. Hesychasm is a discipline that flourished in the monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece. Eastern Orthodox monks have maintained this practice for over 1,000 years. Curiously, it was viewed with deep suspicion by the Western Church. Why? Because it championed the direct experience of the divine, entirely bypassing priestly mediation. The core technique is simple yet profound: repeated contemplative prayer, synchronized with the breath, designed to quiet the mind and open the eyes of your heart. Exactly the phrase that appears in Ephesians 1:18. The Book of Enoch, preserved complete only in Ethiopia, contains extensive descriptions of spiritual visions. Enoch walks with God, and celestial mysteries are revealed to him, not through a priest, not through an institution, but through direct spiritual discipline. And here lies the fundamental threat this knowledge posed to Rome. If any ordinary believer can have direct, unmediated experience of the divine, what need remains for an institutional intermediary? When Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, he wasn't just settling theological squabbles, he was establishing Christianity as a state religion, and that required structure, hierarchy, control. Texts that promoted direct mystical experience, like Enoch, became politically inconvenient. The Council of Laodicea in 364 decreed that Enoch should not be read in churches. By the 5th century, it had vanished completely from the Western canon. But in Ethiopia, insulated from these councils, Enoch was never removed, and the contemplative practices it describes were never censored. Ethiopian monks still practice what they called tselot, deep contemplative prayer, in monasteries carved into inaccessible cliffsides. They claim these practices have been transmitted unbroken since the 4th century. Is the first prayer a magical formula that instantly rips open spiritual dimensions? No. It is a contemplative discipline that, according to these traditions, Jesus practiced and taught. A discipline that was systematically removed from Western teaching because it offered too much power to the individual. This specific revelation is explored in depth in Why the Apostles Concealed Jesus' Most Dangerous Words. Pinned comment number 1. Download it now before it is suppressed. Jesus promised in Mark 16:18 that believers will place their hands on sick people and they will get well. He did not specify that only specially anointed clergy would perform this. He said that those who believe would do it. In the book of Acts, this promise was fulfilled repeatedly. Acts 5:12 records that the apostles performed many signs and wonders among the people, but not just apostles. Acts 8:6-7 describes Philip, not one of the 12, performing mass healings in Samaria. Ananias, identified simply as a disciple in Acts 9-10, lays hands on Saul, and his sight is recovered. He was not a priest. He held no official title. He was a believer acting in faith. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, healing by the laying on of hands was common practice among all believers. The Christian writer Irenaeus in the 2nd century wrote, "Those who are truly his disciples heal the sick by placing their hands upon them and they are recovered." But between the 4th and 6th centuries, a critical shift began. As Christianity solidified into the Roman Empire's state religion, legitimate concerns arose. Hucksters claiming miraculous powers to fleece the vulnerable, false healers charging fees for fabricated wonders, syncretic practices blending Christian faith with pagan sorcery. The institutional response was immediate and understandable: regulate, oversee, establish centralized authority. In 567, the Council of Tours issued a decree. Healers who were not officially ordained must be overseen by church authorities. The stated intention was to protect the faithful from fraud, but what started as regulation quickly morphed into monopolization. By the 13th century, the practice of healing was completely institutionalized. It was no longer about guarding against fraud. It was about controlling who could wield spiritual authority. The Ethiopian traditions preserve what they call the 2nd and 3rd orations, specific prayer techniques accompanied by the laying on of hands, not general requests, but declarations of active faith modeled after Jesus. The 2nd oration focused on physical ailments. In Mark 5:41, Jesus takes the dead girl's hand and declares, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." He doesn't pray for God to raise her, he commands her to rise, and she does. The 3rd oration focused on afflictions we would today call psychological or emotional. Mark 5:8 shows Jesus directly commanding, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit," authority declared, not pleaded for. The Desert Fathers in Egypt, contemporaries of the earliest Ethiopian monks, extensively documented healing practices. Anthony of Egypt, according to his biography written by Athanasius around 360, regularly healed the sick through prayer and the laying on of hands. These practices naturally migrated to Ethiopia when Christianity arrived there in the 4th century, brought by Syrian monks known as the 9 Saints. And because Ethiopia remained geographically isolated, these practices were never subjected to the same process of institutionalization that occurred in the West. Textual evidence of censored practical knowledge even exists. The Book of Tobit, included in the Catholic Bible but removed by the Protestants, contains specific instructions for healing. Tobit 6:7-8 describes procedures using natural elements combined with prayer. The question remains, were the specific words of these healing orations omitted from the canonical Gospels by accident? Or was the knowledge that empowered ordinary believers to exercise spiritual gifts deliberately edited out of the text that became official? The Ethiopian traditions affirm the latter. Listen closely. I need to be blunt with you. This level of research will not remain available indefinitely. The e-book, Why the Apostles Concealed Jesus' Most Dangerous Words, is already drawing scrutiny. If you want full access to this complete investigation, every source, every unearthed document, every hidden connection, download it right now. Pinned comment number 1. Do not wait until it's too late. The Book of Enoch begins with an extraordinary declaration. Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, and who saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens. It does not say a priest had a vision and told Enoch about it. It says Enoch's own eyes were opened. Direct experience, revelation without an intermediary. The text goes on to describe how Enoch received instruction from angels, how he was shown the structure of the heavens, how he learned about celestial calendars, cycles of time, and secrets that, according to the text, were meant to be preserved for generations far off. This book was explicitly cited by the Apostle Jude. Jude 1:14-15 states, Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones. This quote comes directly from Enoch 1:9. Jude therefore considered Enoch authoritative enough to quote in a letter that ultimately found its way into the New Testament canon. Yet mysteriously, the book itself was yanked. In 364 AD, the Council of Laodicea issued a ruling that specific texts were forbidden from being read aloud in churches. Enoch was on that list. The formal pretext? Doubts regarding its authorship. But if you peel back the layers and look at what Enoch actually espouses, a far more compelling reason jumps out. Enoch teaches that righteous individuals can rub shoulders directly with the divine. That visions and profound revelations are not the exclusive domain of a specialized priestly class. It asserts that anyone who walks with God, as Genesis 5:24 records Enoch did, can tap into deep spiritual knowledge. This notion was an existential threat to an institution actively staking its entire authority on the premise that it alone was the indispensable intermediary between the Almighty and mankind. Ethiopian tradition points to the 4th prayer as a contemplative exercise rooted in Enoch's teachings. This isn't about summoning angels or spirits. That's sorcery, strictly forbidden. This is about what Eastern traditions term nepsis, spiritual vigilance. Profound, unwavering focus on the unseen spiritual realm that, according to Ephesians 6:12, surrounds us. The Desert Fathers engaged in this practice extensively. Athanasius wrote of Anthony of Egypt, he possessed the gift of discerning spirits, not because he was special by birthright, but because he had cultivated spiritual sensitivity through years of deliberate contemplative practice. These practices were carried into Ethiopian monasteries when Egyptian monks fled persecution in the 5th century. And because Ethiopia was never a participant in the councils that censored Enoch, these traditions were never suppressed. Fragments of Enoch were later unearthed at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. James van der Kam of the University of Notre Dame has published extensive studies demonstrating that the Qumran community considered Enoch scripture. This proves that long before Christ, devout Jewish communities valued this very text. Therefore, it was not removed because it was bogus or lacked authority. The reasons for its exclusion had far more to do with the type of spiritual experience it championed, direct individual access, than with its historical authenticity. The 4th prayer, according to these traditions, is not a magic incantation used to coerce angels into appearing. It is a contemplative discipline designed to develop what 1 Corinthians 12:10 calls discerning of spirits, a promised gift to all believers, not just reserved for a religious elite. But teaching this widely would mean acknowledging that ordinary believers can possess unmediated spiritual insight, and historically, that has been exactly the kind of power that religious institutions have worked hardest to control. People who have read Why the Apostles Hid Jesus' Most Dangerous Words keep telling me the same thing. I wish I had stumbled across this years ago. Don't be the one kicking yourself later. Pinned comment, download now, join the awakening. And if you've already read it, drop a comment with truth and share one thing that blew your mind. Mark 16:17 records the words of Jesus, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils." It does not say ordained priests shall cast out devils. It says them that believe, anyone who believes. In the book of Acts, we see this mandate fulfilled repeatedly. Acts 8:7 describes how in Samaria, unclean spirits, crying with loud voice, came out of many. Philip, a deacon, not an apostle, was performing mass deliverance. Luke 10:17 records that the 70 disciples, not merely the core 12 apostles, returned overjoyed, saying, "Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name." Spiritual deliverance was a standard practice in early Christianity. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, declared, "Innumerable demoniacs throughout the whole world have been exorcised by ordinary Christians in the name of Jesus Christ. Any believer could do it. It was a promised gift, a sign that would follow those who trust him. But gradually this shifted. In 567 AD, the Council of Tours laid down strict regulations regarding who was permitted to perform exorcisms. By the 16th century, the Roman ritual had fully formalized the process. Only priests with specific episcopal permission could carry out official exorcisms. The question is, why did this aggressive institutionalization occur? One partial answer is pragmatic. Abuses arose. People claiming spiritual authority they didn't possess caused genuine psychological damage. The Church responded by establishing structure and oversight. But another answer is far more inconvenient. Spiritual power is inherently social power. When any average believer possesses the ability to release someone from spiritual bondage, institutional authority begins to evaporate. The Ethiopian traditions preserve what they call the 5th and 6th prayers, specific spiritual deliverance practices passed down orally. These are not complex rituals requiring years of priestly training, but simple declarations of spiritual authority in Jesus' name. The 5th prayer focused on liberation from external oppression, negative spiritual influences. The model appears in Mark 5:8, where Jesus simply commands, "Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit." Authority declared with absolute conviction. The 6th prayer focused on freedom from internal strongholds, destructive thought patterns, addictions, psychological bondage. This aligns squarely with 2 Corinthians 10:4-5, which speaks of pulling down strongholds, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. The Ethiopian monks, operating in isolated cliffside and desert communities, never stopped practicing these prayers. For them, spiritual liberation was not a rare ritual performed by specialists. It was a normal component of communal spiritual life. Historical documents show that during later periods, individuals were actively persecuted for conducting deliverance practices outside of ecclesiastical control, not always because they were charlatans, but because they were exercising spiritual authority without institutional permission. The pattern is stark. Practices that empowered ordinary believers were systematically institutionalized, regulated, and eventually reserved solely for authorized elites. The specific wording, the exact prayers, used in early Christian spiritual deliverance were omitted from the canonical texts. But in Ethiopia, where these texts and traditions were never censored by Roman councils, the practices continued to be transmitted. I am not suggesting that anyone should attempt spiritual liberation without discernment or preparation. The book of Acts itself warns against this in Acts 19:13-16, where exorcists lacking genuine faith were violently attacked by a spirit. What I am pointing out is the historical pattern, knowledge that capacitated ordinary believers was gradually purged from common practice in the West. In Ethiopia, isolated from this institutional consolidation, the knowledge remained. The e-book includes a timeline showing precisely when each text was censored and why. Why the apostles hid Jesus' most dangerous words. Pinned comment. John 11:41-42 records the words of Jesus before raising Lazarus. Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I knew that thou hearest me always. That's it. Those are the only recorded words of his prayer. Then he shouts, Lazarus, come forth, and a man dead for 4 days walks out of the tomb. But chew on this. Are those really all the words Jesus spoke? Or did the text redact something vital? John 11:41 states that Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, he lifted his eyes. Time passed. Then he spoke the words we see recorded. What transpired in that silent moment between lifting his gaze and speaking? The text is mute, but something absolutely occurred. Something was scrubbed from the record. The same applies to Peter in Acts 9:40. When he raises Tabitha, the text says, Peter knelt down and prayed, but it does not record the content of his prayer. It only states that afterward, he turned him to the body and said, Tabitha, arise. What did he pray? The record is silent. Paul raises Eutychus in Acts 20:10. The text describes the action. Paul went down and fell on him, but makes no explicit mention of prayer. Yet the context clearly implies he sought divine intervention. Luke, the author, simply skipped documenting the words. This pattern echoes throughout the Old Testament. Elisha raises the Shunammite's son in 2 Kings 4:33. The text says, he shut the door upon them twain and prayed unto the Lord. It then details physical actions. He lay upon the child, putting his mouth upon his mouth, his eyes upon his eyes, and the boy revived. What words did he pray? They are not recorded. Elijah raises the widow's son in 1 Kings 17:21. And he cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again. A simple request is recorded, but was there more that went undocumented? The Ethiopian traditions make a controversial claim that the specific words, the exact prayers, used in resurrection were intentionally omitted from the canonical texts, not because they were unknown, but because this knowledge was deemed too powerful, too dangerous to be widely distributed. The seventh prayer, according to these traditions, is not a magical formula that instantly revives corpses. It is the culmination of the previous 6. It demands profound spiritual mastery, unwavering faith, direct, unmediated connection to the divine. Jesus himself said in John 14:12, He that believeth on me, the works that I do shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do. He didn't limit this to apostles. He said, he that believeth. So if Jesus raised the dead and promised his followers would do the same and greater, why does this gift seem to have vanished from common Christian practice? The Ethiopian traditions suggest it didn't vanish, it was suppressed, because if ordinary believers could access this level of spiritual power, institutional control would become impossible. Authority would no longer rest on position or title, but on genuine faith and a deep spiritual walk. Let's be clear. These traditions are not suggesting that just anyone can read a prayer and instantly raise the dead. The Ethiopian monks themselves stress that the seventh prayer requires deep spiritual purity, extensive fasting, and absolute faith. The kind of faith Jesus said in Matthew 17:20 could move mountains. But the point remains. Why were the specific words used in biblical resurrections never fully recorded? Why this systematic omission across multiple texts? The simplest explanation is also the most unsettling. They were deliberately omitted. And in Ethiopia, insulated from the councils that compiled the Western canon, oral traditions preserved what the written texts did not contain. Look, I get it. You're skeptical. You've watched 1,000 hidden truth videos. But why the apostles hid Jesus' most dangerous words is not clickbait. It's cited research, academic sources, primary documents. Give it a shot. Download it. Read the first chapter. If it's not exactly what I describe, you've wasted 5 minutes. But if it is, your entire understanding shifts. Pinned comment. Decide for yourself. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity across the Roman Empire. By 380 AD, Under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity became the official state religion of the empire. This shift in status fundamentally transformed the nature of the Christian movement. What had been a decentralized network of scattered communities, each with its own traditions, texts, and practices, needed to become a unified state religion. That required standardization, clear hierarchy, official doctrine. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was called by Constantine not primarily out of theological zeal, but out of political expediency. An empire required a unified faith. Doctrinal disputes threatened social cohesion. The bishops who attended Nicaea were mostly urban administrators, not desert mystics. They understood ecclesiastical maneuvering. They knew their influence depended on clearly defined institutional structures. This context is crucial for understanding why certain texts were included in the canon and others excluded. When a text like the Book of Enoch taught that any righteous person could walk with God and receive direct revelation, it posed complicated questions. If revelation comes straight to individuals, what role do the bishops play? How is doctrinal orthodoxy maintained? I am not arguing that these concerns were entirely without merit. In any decentralized religious movement, genuine pitfalls emerge: contradictory doctrines, abusive charismatic leaders, communities sliding toward syncretism with pagan practices. The need for some structure and oversight was legitimate, but what began as a necessary effort to safeguard the Christian message slowly morphed into a calculated consolidation of institutional power. The Council of Laodicea in 364 AD established which books could be read in the churches. Enoch, a text cited in the New Testament by Jude, was shut out. The official justification was doubtful authorship, but the reality was more complex. Its content advocating direct mystical experience simply did not fit the emerging institutional model. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD finalized the Old Testament canon. Several factors influenced these decisions: perceived antiquity of the texts, use in liturgy, general acceptance among churches. But there were also practical considerations about which texts best supported the ecclesiastical structure that was solidifying. By the 6th century, we see the Council of Tours regulating who could heal. In subsequent centuries, spiritual practices that were once common were being strictly reserved for authorized clergy. Historian Bart Ehrman of UNC Chapel Hill has written extensively on this. His research documents how multiple forms of early Christianity existed, some more hierarchical, others more charismatic, others more Gnostic, and how one form, backed by imperial power, gradually suppressed the alternatives. This was not necessarily malicious conspiracy. It was the natural process of institutionalization that occurs in any movement that grows large and formalizes. But it had consequences. Texts that emphasized direct, unmediated spiritual experience were classified as apocryphal. Practices that democratized access to spiritual power were regulated and eventually prohibited for lay people. Ethiopia presents a fascinating case study precisely because it sat outside this process. Geographically isolated, it never participated in the ecumenical councils. The decisions made in Rome, Constantinople, and Carthage simply never applied there. Thus, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the Book of Enoch, not because they were rebels, but because they never received the memo that it needed to be dropped. They preserved contemplative spiritual practices, not because they rejected authority, but because they operated in a context where that authority was never centralized in the same way. The result is that Ethiopia became a living repository for forms of Christianity that vanished elsewhere. Not better or worse forms, but different forms, accidentally preserved by geographical isolation. And that gives us a unique window into what Christianity looked like before the institutional consolidation of the 4th century onward. Stop watching. Go download the ebook. Why the Apostles Hid Jesus' Most Dangerous Words. Pinned comment. Then come back and finish this video. I'll wait. In 330 AD, King Ezana of Aksum converted to Christianity, making Ethiopia one of the world's first Christian nations, decades before Rome officially adopted Christianity as a state religion. Ethiopian Christianity developed in relative isolation from the start. Trade routes connecting Ethiopia to the Mediterranean began to dwindle in the 5th century, and then, in the 7th century, rapid Islamic expansion completely severed contact between Ethiopia and the Western Christian world. For over 800 years, from roughly 650 to 1500 AD, Ethiopia was almost entirely cut off from the rest of Christendom. No papal legacy had ever visited. No ecumenical council ever included Ethiopian representatives. The liturgical and doctrinal shifts that fundamentally reshaped Western Christianity simply never penetrated the Ethiopian highlands. And in that deep isolation, something truly extraordinary was preserved. Forms of primitive Christianity that were either transformed or wholly discarded elsewhere. Ethiopian monks still chant liturgies in Ge'ez, a language that vanished from daily conversation in the 9th century, yet has been used continuously in sacred contexts. It is functionally similar to how Latin operates in the Catholic Church, but with an even longer thread of continuity. The Garima manuscripts, carbon dated by Oxford University to between 390 and 660 CE, are still actively used in church services today. They predate every complete biblical manuscript held by the Vatican, yet they remain active working liturgical texts. The 11 monolithic churches of Lalibela, hewn directly from solid bedrock during the 12th century, remain active sites of worship a millennium later. UNESCO designated them a World Heritage Site in 1978. The engineering precision, entire churches carved top-down out of a massive chunk of stone, still leaves contemporary structural engineers scratching their heads. How were they built using only medieval technology? Local tradition asserts that King Lalibela was assisted by angels. Archaeologists readily admit they have no full explanation for several construction aspects, particularly the precise alignments and the drainage systems that function perfectly after 900 years. What is verifiable? These churches demonstrate that Ethiopian Christianity in the 12th century was vibrant, organized, and sufficiently well-funded to undertake monumental engineering projects. And these churches still house ancient texts, still practice the Ge'ez liturgies, still safeguard traditions that connect directly back to 4th and 5th century Christianity. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce arrived in Ethiopia in 1773, he was astonished to find the Ethiopian church possessed texts that Europe considered lost for centuries. Bruce carried back 3 copies of the Book of Enoch, the first time the complete text reached Europe in over 1,000 years. The initial response from European scholars was absolute skepticism. Many dismissed the text as a crude medieval forgery. How could Ethiopia, a place barely known to Europe, hold a lost ancient text? But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed in 1947, fragments of Aramaic Enoch were found among the Qumran documents. This proved conclusively that the Ethiopian text was not a medieval fabrication, but the authentic preservation of an original pre-Christian Jewish text. Suddenly, the academic narrative had to shift on a dime. Ethiopia was not a backward religious backwater. It was the careful guardian of some of the oldest, best-preserved Christian traditions on the planet. Today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church boasts approximately 45 million members globally. It continues to use its 82-book canon. It continues to practice liturgical traditions that stretch back to the 4th century, not because they are rebels fighting Rome or Constantinople, but because they never accepted that those power centers had the authority to dictate what Ethiopian Christians should believe or practice. This truth is now resonating worldwide. The e-book, Why Did the Apostles Hide Jesus' Most Dangerous Words?, is in the hands of seekers from Manila to Mexico City. Where are you tuning in from? Download, first pinned comment, then drop your location below. For decades, Western scholars dismissed the Ethiopian Book of Enoch as a medieval text of no historical value. The dominant academic narrative asserted it was a late composition, a forgery with no real connection to Second Temple Judaism or early Christianity. This position collapsed entirely in 1947. That year, Bedouins looking for a stray goat discovered caves near Qumran by the Dead Sea shore. Inside, they found ceramic jars containing manuscripts, hundreds of them, carefully preserved for nearly 2 millennia. Among those manuscripts were fragments of Enoch in Aramaic, dated to between 200 BCE and the 1st century CE. This proved 3 things irrefutably. First, Enoch existed centuries before Christ. It was not a medieval Christian invention or an Ethiopian forgery. Second, the Qumran community, likely the Essenes, considered Enoch important enough to copy and painstakingly preserve alongside texts like Isaiah, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and other books that eventually became canonical. Third, the Ethiopian text of Enoch, preserved in Ge'ez, is a faithful translation of the original Aramaic. When the Qumran fragments were translated and compared to the Ethiopian Enoch, the correspondence was remarkable. Ethiopia had been telling the truth the entire time. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the world's foremost experts on the Book of Enoch, has dedicated his career to this text. His research, published in Enoch and the Growth of an Apocalyptic Tradition, 2008, conclusively shows that Enoch was regarded as sacred scripture by pious Jewish communities in the centuries immediately preceding and following Christ. So why was it removed from the Christian canon? Vanderkam and other scholars point out it wasn't because the text lacked authenticity. It was because its content, particularly its teachings on direct revelation, angelic communication, and celestial calendars that differed from the official Jewish lunar calendar, made it theologically problematic for institutions seeking doctrinal uniformity. The Garima manuscripts in Ethiopia offer another undeniable scientific validation. For decades, Western historians argued that Ethiopia could not possibly possess manuscripts this old. They claimed Ethiopian Christianity was a relatively late development, likely 7th or 8th century. In 2010, a team from Oxford University performed carbon dating on the Garima manuscripts using accelerator mass spectrometry techniques, the most precise method available. The results stunned even the researchers. The manuscripts date from 330–650 CE, with some sections possibly as early as 390 CE. This makes them contemporary with, or even older than, the Codex Vaticanus, c. 300–350 CE, and the Codex Sinaiticus, c. 330–360 CE, which until then were considered the oldest existing complete biblical manuscripts. Dr. Judith Mackenzie of Oxford, who led the dating project, stated, "This discovery rewrites what we knew about early Christianity in Africa." Suddenly, Ethiopia was not peripheral to Christian history. It was central. The churches of Lalibela provide further architectural proof of Ethiopian Christianity's sophistication. 11 monolithic churches excavated directly from volcanic rock during the 12th century. Not built with assembled blocks but carved top-down, removing stone until complete church structures were left. The precision is jaw-dropping. Windows are perfectly aligned to capture light at specific liturgical moments. The roofs boast complex geometry, with clear theological symbolism. The drainage systems, crucial in monsoon climate, work perfectly 900 years later. Dr. David Phillipson of Cambridge University, who has studied these structures for decades, admits, "The required engineering exceeds what we understand about medieval construction capabilities in this region. Local tradition insists they were built in 24 years under King Lalibela, aided by angels." Archaeologists can't verify the angelic assistance, but they also can't fully explain how the construction was possible with 12th century technology. What is indisputable from any perspective, these churches demonstrate that Ethiopian Christianity was organized, financed, and technically sophisticated enough to undertake monumental projects. And these churches still shelter manuscripts, still practice ancient liturgies, still hold traditions that connect directly to the earliest forms of Christianity. In 2012, Dr. Caroline T. Schroeder of the University of Oklahoma published Monastic Bodies, Discipline and Salvation in Shenut of Atripe, showing direct continuity between 4th century Egyptian monastic practices and contemporary Ethiopian traditions. The modern academic evidence is clear. Ethiopia preserved ancient forms of Christianity that were either transformed or abandoned elsewhere during the processes of institutionalization between the 4th and 7th centuries. "I'll download it later." That's what people say. Then they forget. Then the link is taken down. Don't be that person. Why did the apostles hide Jesus' most dangerous words? 2 clicks, 30 seconds. Do it now, while the thought is fresh. First, pinned comment. We have covered significant ground in this video. Let me synthesize what we have uncovered together. The Ethiopian Bible contains 82 books, 16 more than Protestant Bibles, 9 more than Catholic Bibles. These extra books are not worthless medieval forgeries. They are ancient texts, some even quoted in the New Testament, that were systematically excluded from the Western canon during the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries. The Book of Enoch, explicitly cited by the Apostle Jude, was removed from the canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364. Not because it lacked authenticity, the Dead Sea Scrolls prove its pre-Christian origin. The reasons had everything to do with the type of spiritual experience it promoted: direct revelation without institutional mediation. The 7 prayers, traditions concerning specific spiritual practices preserved in Ethiopian monastic communities, represent knowledge that was systematically omitted from Western canonical texts, not because it was unknown, but because it empowered ordinary individuals with access to profound spiritual experience. Every text that democratized that experience was censored or classified as apocryphal. Every practice that allowed common believers to exercise spiritual gifts promised in the New Testament was gradually institutionalized and eventually forbidden to the laity. This pattern is not an accident. It is the result of institutional consolidation processes that occurred as Christianity transitioned from a decentralized spiritual movement into a structured state religion. Ethiopia preserved alternatives to this process, not because Ethiopians were uniquely holy or enlightened, but because they were safely insulated from the councils that made these decisions. And today, thanks to archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, scientific dating of manuscripts like the Garima, and the work of modern scholars, we can validate what Ethiopian traditions have asserted for centuries. The question now is personal. What will you do with this information? You can dismiss it as too controversial, too unsettling. You can retreat to more comfortable narratives. Or you can investigate deeper, examine the primary sources, study the academic evidence, decide for yourself what the facts reveal. The 7 prayers are still practiced in Ethiopian monasteries today. The knowledge was not completely lost. It was preserved by communities that maintained connection to older forms of Christianity, and now that knowledge is available to anyone willing to look for it. If you made it this far, you are exactly the type of person this channel exists for. 3 things before you go. First, download. Why did the apostles hide Jesus' most dangerous words? If you haven't already. This isn't a sales pitch. This is essential context for everything we discuss here. First pinned comment. Get your copy now. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Next video. The Lost Gospel of Judas. Why the traitor apostle may have been the most faithful. You won't want to miss it. Third, consider becoming a channel member. The ebook is powerful, but membership grants you access to research, sources, and discussions we can never make fully public. Our inner circle is already connecting dots most people will never see. Join by clicking the join button below. Thank you for watching. Write truth if this resonated. I'll see you in the next investigation.